Alright, so now that the bottom half of our trim is complete, I am going to replace this node with a switch node, switch grayscale. And this is what I'm going to use to be switching back and forth between just the trim half bottom and the top half of the trim. And then later on down the line, I don't know if I'm going to do it post material creation or pre material creation, I'll switch to using the 2:1 ratio, so 1024 by 2048. As I've mentioned before, it's a bit weird trying to work in it, and I'm going to show you how to fix in the issues we'll generate later on once we switch to it. I'm going to go ahead and delete this. And then before I change this, I've noticed the intensity on this is a bit too much. So I'm going to fix that real quick too. The levels node. We'll just move this down. Alright, and I may add a little bit more, make some changes later on. Let's go to here and set this to false. And the first thing I want to add on this half is this pattern right here. And instead of doing this section fully procedural and also some of these elements down here fully procedural, I'm going to be using the SVG node, because although this can be done fully procedural, it can be very time consuming to do stuff like this procedurally. So I'll often opt out to use the SVG node, especially for production purposes, if you aren't trying to do some crazy and impressive fully procedural thing. You should always go for what's fastest. In this section here, I'm going to be making another trim sheet section. Basically, it's going to be another big square, just like we did with the trim half bottom. This is going to be the trim half top. And later on, we are going to combine it to make the 2:1 ratio trim sheet. And to start things off, I'm going to be using an SVG node here to draw out the shapes. And the reason for this is simply because it's fast and efficient. You don't need to make everything 100% procedural, especially if you aren't going to be really relying on modifying a substance at a time and modifying all the shapes. SVG gets the job done, it's fast, and it lets you more creatively make complex shapes. Here I'm making a decal element. So this little shape here is going to have an opacity mask around it once I get to the material portion of this tutorial. So if this has an opacity mask around it, you can actually map this shape to a single rectangular polygon and then take that polygon and have it float just barely in front of a wall. And if you do that, it'll look like that detail is right there. You can slide that polygon around and decide where that detail goes. And you'll see me do that once I get onto the modeling time-lapse portion of this. Something else to note on this shape here is it's a symmetrical shape. And I am going broad on some things with this trim sheet here, but sometimes you'll need to fit even more detail in a trim sheet than what I'm doing here. So an example on this is you could actually cut this element straight in half horizontally here, and then when you go into the modeling portion, you would actually have a rectangle that has a cut down the center because it'll be mirrored. That way you can just mirror the texture, and yeah, it's going to be mirrored, but if you're layering other details on top, like with vertex painting and dirt decals, it won't be that noticeable. And since it's already symmetrical, it won't be too noticeable in the first place. This floating decal element is another example of something that I could cut down the half here, so I just have half of it on the texture sheet, and then when I get the modeling phase, I would have a total of 2 quads, having it mapped to the mirror it. That way I can save even more space here and get even more unique elements. The whole idea of your trim sheet is to get the best bang for your space. So you want to get as much real estate used as possible. Now this kind of diamond pattern I'm placing down isn't going to be a floating decal element or anything. I mean, it could be if you wanted it to, but this is kind of just a tiling texture space. There's a few elements I saw that have this kind of pattern on it, but the elements weren't like gigantic or anything. So I don't need an entire texture with just this pattern material. I can have a very small portion of my trim sheet have the pattern and then just map my model's UVs to this section. You could also take this pattern and use it in a lot more creative ways. If I want to put it up high on something, I could have like a little caps at the top and then have it tile across that. And if you want this to actually tile linearly on your models, you can map just a rectangle to it and then mirror that, and it will tile across in kind of a mirrored fashion.